Okay, let's make a start, because it's going to be a rich discussion. So to make the most of everyone being here, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good morning from an absolutely sweltering UK. And I hope everyone is well. Thanks so much, all of you, for giving up your time. We're about 30 people, which is a great number for a really good discussion. Yeah, just to introduce myself, I'm Arabella Fraser. I'm a research fellow in geography at the University of Nottingham. And I've been working on this project from the UK with Francis Crowley, who's been the research fellow on this project as well. And this project has really arisen out of our GCRF Global Engagement Network, Climate Change and Urban Violence Network. So do take a look at that if you haven't. It's ccuvn.org, and that network runs until March 2022. This has been a really collaborative partnership between colleagues in Karachi, Colombo and Nairobi, as well as the two of us in the UK. I'm just going to do a quick piece of housekeeping, give you a background to the project, and then let our city colleagues talk from their recent research experiences. We're very lucky to have Jaideep Gupta from IDS, and also Amy Jones from ICLE to give us a couple of reflections to help provoke us in the discussion. But there will also be time for kind of questions, both about this kind of specifics of the cities as well as the kind of analytics of the project over the contexts. So the project we're going to talk about today, I'm going to emphasize this is really exploratory. It's a pilot project. We had funding from GCRF, QR funding for 5 months, so not a long project at all, but really to start to investigate some of the linkages between non-conflict violence and climate change in urban contexts. Some of the work being presented today, we haven't even heard between the research team, so that's exciting. It's very raw, it's very fresh. We wanted to do this webinar while the project still felt very live, so that we could kind of share our emergent thoughts and get perspectives back in. And what I want to do, I don't want to over kind of foreclose the discussion by focusing down too early, but I wanted to give you a flavour of maybe 4 emergent themes coming from our project discussions of where the project is kind of centering and where the findings are speaking to, and that gives you something in mind as you're listening to the presentations. And the first thing that this project has really sought to do was to document the lived experience of multiple risks and multiple insecurities. And what's coming out, we think, from some of our findings is how this relates to time, to space, and to social identity, and that this is really germane to discussions at the moment about how multiple vulnerabilities collide, layer, compound, and the pandemic's really brought this discussion to the fore, whether in terms of systemic risks or compounding vulnerabilities. And even the title 24-hour urban risk, was inspired by an ActionAid report actually about women's experiences of urban violence in Africa, and really prompting us to think about the way over daily cycles risk is experienced both in public and private spaces, and how that is interspersed with forms of flood risk and heat risk. And we're going to hear about some of that interrelationship in a minute. But also across space. And we've talked about how in the urban context, risks are made manifest, but obviously have their roots in processes that stretch across space and across time and history, kind of, but also in the context of kind of rural urban relationships. So these long-term processes of risk accumulation that then become manifest in some of the voices and lived experiences we're hearing. And the importance of social identity. So we started off feeling that a gender perspective would be hugely important to this project, and inspired by this thinking about 24-hour risk of women's particular experiences of urban violence. But we're going to hear a lot, I think, as well about how obviously that's deeply intersectional. My colleagues in Karachi have already talked about the differences for Christian and Muslim women in the neighbourhoods they're working in of these experiences. So that's kind of theme 1. The second theme was around climate security, and we really wanted to push off against notions of climate security that are in kind of gaining, again, increasing policy currency, but we wanted to push back again against kind of linear deterministic notions that, you know, increases in climate change impacts can be automatically kind of correlated with increases in conflict. We wanted to ground something more nuanced and something in the urban context that allowed us to look at how multiple forms of non-conflict violence, and there are multiple forms, from gender-based violence through to kind of looting and crime, through to eviction. It's a spectrum of interrelated violences relate to that interrelated climate risks. And we're going to talk today about flooding and heat in ways that might actually be highly contingent. And I'm aware that a danger for this project is that in looking for experiences of insecurity, we overlook forms of cooperation and collaboration that might also arise in those contexts. So, you know, moving to that more nuanced view of climate security, but also moving away from a focus on kind of geopolitical conflict risks as related to climate change, to look at it in the context of urban non-conflict violence, which is rising in cities and increasingly forms a large share of the burden of violence globally. Third theme, and Amy, it'd be fascinating particularly to hear from you here, is about fragility. So where institutions, particularly state institutions, are absent or antagonistic to the needs and interests of the populations we're working with, what does that mean for policy intervention and for the kind of practice implications for our project? This is not an easy question at all, and I think we will hear from the three contexts. You will understand from the context quite immediately that these are contexts where there is often very, very little intervention, or it is sporadic, or it creates conflict in its intervention. So what are the prospects for supporting the most vulnerable groups in these communities to adapt to climate change? And certainly my own feeling is that has been a really neglected piece of the kind of urban adaptation literature, which often assumes that there are stable and trusted multi-stakeholder relationships. Actually, the windows for intervention may be tight, and there may be long-term processes of kind of institution building and trust building that need to go with that. So provoking us to think about fragility and what that means for policy intervention. And finally, we wanted to use this as a forum to talk about methodological approaches, epistemological approaches. We are encountering a number of challenges that we actually think are quite interesting to reflect on in terms of research. The first is obviously the complexity of running a partnership like this virtually, which is what we've been doing in the context of the pandemic. But the second is the adaptations our research teams who are able to work locally have had to make to accommodate not only COVID and the impact of lockdowns in all the cities involved, but multiple risks. So our Karachi team may talk a little bit about how they have had to work given the context of heat stress and the difficulties of being out in the middle of the day and having to work shifts and go in the evening, and what that means for who you can talk to and how. But also populations across our cities that have been traumatised by losses from flooding or losses from evictions, how, particularly in a short time frame, one can work really ethically with them. And we have put that ethics as paramount over the need to kind of extract information, which leads us to the final area of methods we set out to explore, which was how we could cross-fertilise innovation across the kind of urban violence risk research and climate change risk research. And I think that's raised a lot of questions, and I don't know if Atufa wants to say anything about this today. She's been doing a bit of thinking in the background about this, but you know, innovations that initially we thought we might be able to use using apps to track kind of women's safety or violence have actually not necessarily been appropriate for the areas we're working in because of their marginality, because of people's lack of access to data. So, you know, how we can modify the very practice of research from working in such fragile areas. I think that question is still up in the air, and we're interested in innovation here, how we can adapt some of those methods for tracking kind of those 24-hour cycles of risk, but in a way that is appropriate to the way that people are living their lives. The final thing to say before I hand over, and I'm going to hand over to Karachi, then Colombo, then Nairobi, and kind of introduce them in turn, is that because of the structure of the project funding, we were able to fund IBA Karachi to a much greater extent than our two non-academic colleagues, which was a real shame, but it is what it is. So by function of that, what the Karachi team have been able to do is much larger in scale than the other two teams. But that is not to say that the richness of the qualitative material that is still coming from our Colombo and Nairobi teams is not of great insight. It is, but just to be aware that there was that kind of parameter on what we could and couldn't do. So first to hand over to our Karachi team, and I'm sure Nausheen will introduce all the team. But principally handing over to Nausheen and Gulnaz. Nausheen is the director of Karachi Urban Lab and co-directs with me the Climate Change and Urban Violence Network. Yeah, and she will probably say a bit more about her own work on urbanisation in South Asia, as well as her work with other organisations such as IDRC and the International Red Cross. She's joined by Gulnaz Anjum, who's an Associate Professor of Psychology at the Institute of Business Administration in Karachi, but also a visiting researcher at Simon Fraser University. And she's previously conducted fascinating research about the links between heat stress and interpersonal violence, but has also brought, along with Vyanga from Colombo, really important kind of psychological elements to the project, looking right down at the level of the individual and how people experience violence and risk interpersonally and at an individual level. So Nasheen and Gulnaz.
Great, thank you so much, Ari. So we have about 5 minutes each. I have 5 minutes, Gulnaz has 5 minutes because of the time that we have before us today. So I don't want to spend too much time talking about myself. So I'm Professor of City and Regional Planning at the Institute of Business Administration in Karachi. It's a public sector university, and as Ari already mentioned, I'm also the founder and director of the Karachi Urban Lab, and I work on issues of climate change risks, climate change impacts on cities across South Asia, but specifically on Pakistan, and alongside that on issues of migration, urban informal economy, informal land, displacements, dispossessions, and now increasingly getting more deeply into the study of heat. I'm leading an extensive project with colleagues across the global south and global north on heating and cooling. So heat is something that occupies my mind extensively these days, especially since we're in the middle of a particularly hot summer in Karachi, and this is something that's certainly impacted our ability to get out into the field and do research. And so I'll highlight this very briefly. So very quickly, our methods for this pilot project were based on starting in April, observations, and then June, July, household surveys. We aimed for about 100 household surveys across 2 informal settlements that we found interesting to engage with, as these lie along the city's main drainage channels that have become an object of governance and much or significant controversy these days. Karachi's drainage channels, which are part of its natural ecology, have become blocked over the last 3 or 4 decades for a variety of reasons: real estate developments, infrastructural developments, mega projects, and a general degraded infrastructures, lack of sanitation, lack of clearance of sewage, and so forth. So for the dozens and dozens of informal settlements that have emerged and are located along these different drainage channels and their tributaries, such as Kwasaniazi Colony and Ilyas Court, that we are going to talk about today, which our study is based on, these particular settlements have now become the object of anti-eviction drives. In fact, the residents in these settlements are being blamed for what happened last year, which was in 2020, an unprecedented moment of urban floods in Karachi, over 400 millimeters of rainfall, which is supposed to be linked with climate change, although we're not entirely sure. And this in a city that experiences an average rainfall of 200 millimeters, during the monsoon season. So we then also engaged with IDIs, with men and women, in focus group discussions, and all of this in a context of challenges that we face regarding COVID, lockdowns, heat, typically an ambient temperature of anywhere from 40 to 45 Celsius, but a heat index which is much higher, around 50 to 60. And then alongside that, the devastation and the violence caused by the eviction drives. So just to give you a very, very quick overview, Karachi is a highly unequal city. It's a city of 16 million, which is according to 2017 census, but the unofficial population is 25 million. And I want to state the unofficial figure because this is the figure that the utilities work off of. For instance, the Karachi Water and Sewerage Board and the main utility company, Karachi Electric. And 62% of its population resides in informal settlements. And typically, as is the case across many cities in the global south, we see in the informal settlements issues of erratic or disconnected infrastructures. Sindh, and where Karachi is located, is considered South Asia's hotspots for climate change. And Sindh, and more specifically Karachi and Sindh's urban centers, has experienced heat waves. In the 2015 heat wave particularly was devastating. It caused over 1,200 deaths. recurrent urban floods, the 2021 being unprecedented. And with this also the 2010 riverine floods across Pakistan, but more specifically in Sindh, where over 800,000 people were displaced. And this is pertinent because many of the displacees eventually went and settled in cities across Sindh, such as, for instance, Karachi, and many have not gone back to their points of origin because for many of them, homes no longer exist. So climate risks we see are increasingly intersecting with long-standing structural inequalities, issues of urban planning, and so forth. So very quickly, Costa Niazi colony, one of the settlements that we worked in, informal settlement, Muslim Christian neighborhood, low to low middle income, has experienced recurrent floods, but now increasingly an object of anti-eviction drives. And then alongside this, Ilyas Court, which is also an informal settlement, but comprising mostly of Jhuggis, very, very poor, marginalized community. Ilyas Court was destroyed in the early 2000s due to a mega infrastructure project, but then it was rebuilt and resettled upon by displacees of the 2010 riverine floods. So what we are seeing in context of these complex sort of overlay between vulnerabilities and risks and uncertainties is very much the issue of different kinds of migrations caused by different dynamics of displacement that are related to climate risks, but also due to certain historical reasons. For instance, the constant flooding of the Indus, River plains, which have resulted due to salinity, which have resulted in the loss of agricultural life and subsistence economies, etc. So all of this kind of telescoping in a way, this sort of collapsing of geographies, in terms of different kinds of climate and climate-related risks and structural inequalities, etc., coming together. And so some of the things that we've been looking at vis-a-vis our initial preliminary survey findings in terms of women's vulnerabilities is, for instance, that during urban flooding, women worry constantly about the use of washrooms because they find it very challenging, unlike the men in their neighborhoods, to use open-air washrooms. Female-headed households typically are prone to multiple risks. Women are unable to go outside, and they fear losing their jobs, and this, they say, leads to food insecurity. And then one of the most important things that we have observed and witnessed over the last several months, of course, in these different locations are the demolitions and anti-encroachment drives, where many homes that have been partially destroyed, this partial destruction has led to another cycle of 24-hour risk where women stand up are awake all night guarding their homes because the front doors and the front walls have been decimated. So the risk is from theft, from burglary, and if you have daughters in the house, then the risk to their honor. So I will stop right here, and my colleague Dr. Gulnaz will take over on the quantitative numbers on that analysis. Over to you, Gulnaz.
Thank you, Nausheen. Let me just put up my slides. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can, Gulnaz.
Perfect, great. Okay. Thank you so much. I'll just right away delve into the survey. So before that, I just want to thank Eri and Nausheen for introduction and also for this great opportunity. So the key findings that we have from the Karachi team, they are related to the survey that we conducted. And again, it's a pilot survey. So in this one, we have tried to cover based on multiple diversities that are inherent in the field or the two communities we have worked together on. So we had equal participation of gender, as you can see over here. Similarly, we had diversity in the age range. We had people who were young, people who were from middle ages, and also people who were from late adulthood. Similarly, as our two neighborhoods, they had quite a lot of diversity. So we had Muslim participants, we had Christian participants, and we had Hindu participants. Just to give you a quick overview of what these occupational demographics or diversities look like. So there was a wide range of occupational occupations that our participants occupied, but If we look into how formally or informally we can divide these distributions, we could see that most of these people were from informal, they were working in informal occupation. And again, this also shows that how vulnerable people can become even on a higher level when particularly they are working in informal settlements and also in informal occupational categories. One thing that we really wanted to emphasize on, because our project was more about what are the everyday urban risks. So in this category, we developed 15 dimensions, and these dimensions were based on the initial interviews and focus group discussions that we held with our participants. And in this one, we understood that there are multiple layers of vulnerabilities, urban risks that are available even as a baseline. So in order to understand that how these climate vulnerabilities such as heat waves or urban floods, how do these impact us? We needed to determine first what is the baseline for all of these urban risks. So to that end, we divided them on a Likert scale in such a way that we could see when there are least effects to most effects, and then we could derive boundaries from there that, like, you know, in which dimensions, what kind of effects we should be expecting. So on that level, we saw that income was a huge, like generally, even in everyday urban risks, without like, you know, talking about the climate change, we could see that there are really lots of concerns about income prospects, psychological vulnerability, secure access to wash, and access to transportation and electricity. And other than that, we had, like, you know, loss of household possessions and hazards or risks associated with building and housing materials. And I think, I mean, out of these 15, these were the only, like, you know, 7 risks that were quite apparent. And later on, we'll show you through our, like, you know, findings on the climate related risks and how those get to be more exacerbated. So as you can see over here, the blue mapping, it shows how it's also gendered. For example, males, they show much higher vulnerability on most of these aspects. And as Nosheen just mentioned, that when it comes to wash or access to, like, you know, these facilities that are really kind of also gendered when it comes to social norms or ethics of care. So these vulnerabilities are quite high, both for men and women. But other than that, like, you know, we see that mostly females have these, like, you know, urban risks that are related to more care roles when they're concerned about the household and, like, you know, all the other dimensions that happen within the households. But when it comes to physical vulnerabilities in the urban living, it's mostly men who are kind of, like, you know, at the forefront. And to many of, like, you know, these dimensions, we could see that they replicate, but also they exacerbate when we talk about climate risks. So before we talk about climate risks, it was important for us to know what kind of risks are perceived as kind of, like, you know, major climate events for people. So when we asked these participants, we surveyed, like, you know, how many of them they perceive these kind of events or climate related changes. So all of them, they reported that, like, you know, all of them, they have suffered some kinds of losses. So if we look into the details within our survey, we find that most of the people, they have been kind of victims, or they have lost a lot within their urban lives because of the urban floods, for example, the ones that happened in 2020, or multiple other events. So it's also important to note that we can't just always kind of locate that, okay, these are the events that are happening and these are the impacts, but there are multiplicity of impacts that are happening. One important finding that we found was that people are just so used to this chronic heat, and the heat is always working in the background. So in the light of recent events such as urban floods and, like, you know, last year's floods, etc., people are much more concerned about, like, you know, major urban risks that they have to feel or perceive instead of thinking about, like, you know, heat that is constantly there, but it's working pretty much in the background. Moreover, when we talk about urban risks or losses that people have faced because of these, like, you know, floods or these other events that we have just mentioned, we found that we could see the comparisons when people were going through these events, for example, these floods, and also when they were done with these events and when they move forward with their life. So over here, as you can see, these are the same dimensions for which we determined our baseline. And as you might remember from the previous graphs, that we showed that there were few dimensions where we could see spikes, but when it comes to during going through these urban events and climate change related events, people experience many more losses compared to just a few spikes that happened before or after those events. So over here you can see when it comes to the largest boundaries of highest impacts or most negative impacts, people, especially men, they experience all kinds of impacts. So loss of households, other impacts, multiplicity of impacts, income prospects, psychological vulnerability. So you name it, all of these, they get really exacerbated. Particularly, we were really interested, and also we are exploring this in further our qualitative interviews as well. So the state violence, tenure security, and hazards, literally the physical hazards, they're just so huge that we don't see that kind of pronounced notion of even heat waves. So because if someone is losing their houses, or there is there are heightened concerns about tenure security, because when there are floods, even people who are the victims, they are being blamed for the fact that these floods are happening. So their tenures, they become much more insecure. Another finding that was important for us to know that these effects are also very gendered. So all of these physical vulnerabilities, they're much more heightened when it comes to a perception of men or experiences of men compared to women. But then within these dimensions, there are some dimensions that would be more pronounced. For example, the concerns about wash, or psychological vulnerabilities, or for example, state-related violence, which is pretty pronounced in both genders. However, when we move forward and we see that when we are asking people about what happens after these events, so soon after these events, these dimensions, they also go back to many of the dimensions, but some of these aspects, for example, income related prospects, or psychological vulnerability, or access to electricity, or state related violence or hazards, they continue to stay pronounced, which also shows us that once the people are out of these floods, they're not actually out of them. They're still facing all of these risks, these perceptions, these hazards non-stop. So it's important to kind of understand these vulnerabilities. They don't go away when the floods would go away. Lastly, we just wanted to also emphasize that what kind of support is available to people when they are going through these difficult times. So we see that half of the time there is no support available, but if it is there, then we can see that government is nowhere to be seen, nor are the international organization. So it's usually the community or the local organizations with which people kind of have some relationship, and they are offering some support. Last but not the least, we saw that regarding COVID crisis, all the participants reported that it has extremely badly impacted all the risks that were already there, but they're exacerbated even more. And we see the categories, for example, things getting worse, or they're extremely bad, or they're really not livable. So all these dimensions, they were much more pronounced. So I'll leave the rest of the graphs and data for our discussion. If we have more questions, we'd love to share those with you. Thank you.
Very much, Gulnaz, and thank you, Nashin. And Gulnaz, obviously feel free to bring those slides back into the discussion. I know there is a huge amount more to say, but I'm going to move really swiftly on to Colombo. Danesh, Jayatilaka, and Vyanga. Danesh is the co-founder and chairs the Centre for Migration Research and Development. And he has collaborated with a number of research institutions on issues around displacement, resettlement and relocation in urban areas. Vyanga has joined us as a researcher at the International Centre for Ethnic Studies in Colombo, and she is a researcher on women's empowerment, post-conflict issues and the psychological well-being of vulnerable groups. So Danesh and Vyanga.
Can you see Arabella?
Not yet, Danesh.
It's disappeared.
Would you like me to share the slides, Danesh?
Yes, Francis, I seem to be.
I'll do that right now, and if you just tell me to move on when needs to be.
Oh, can you see it now?
Yeah, we can.
Okay. Sorry, apologies. Thank you, Arabella, and thanks to all colleagues. My team is Vianga and Abdullah Azam, who's here. And I also want to thank a couple of colleagues who have joined, Sakina Ali Khan and Mohideen Ali Khan. We drew on their community profiles, and Professor Resha Lakshman, who reviewed our tools, and then 4 translators and our field contacts and the respondents. The study is on Colombo City. Some of you probably have been there. As you know, Colombo is relatively small compared to some of the other cities in South Asia, and it's modern. There are, however, pockets of small underserved communities scattered. They're not very big. And there is floods. Colombo is a low-lying city. There are floods happening. These sites, we had 2 sites in Colombo called Lunupokun.
Hi, Danesh.
Yeah.
Sorry to disturb you. Do you want to open the presentation? I can see only your Dropbox folder.
Oh, sorry. Arabella, Francis, can you share my folder, my presentation?
Yeah, we'll do. No problem. Can you see those?
Yeah, first slide, second slide, Francis. Yeah, so we had 2 sites, and it's Lunupokun and Samantanapura. The reason we selected these 2 sites were because they were part of a ongoing study on infrastructure and services with actually GCRF research with Sussex. And both of them are not very big. They have flooding issues, and both have issues of drugs, crime, etc. And then one of them is by the river, the other one is by the canal. And because of that, the water comes in. Next slide, Francis.
Can you see those? My screen has gone blank.
We can't, Francis. Danesh, just in the interest of time, I would suggest you carry on. We'll try and make the slides catch up.
Yeah, so our methodology was, we had 2 methods. One was index interviews, and the other was focus groups. And we managed to do most of it. Our target audience were flood-affected women. And we did use phones quite extensively. In fact, we never visited the sites because of the lockdown and the restrictions here. Everything was done by phone interviews. And the analysis was thematic analysis and quotes. So this is the sites. They're both sort of in North Colombo. The first one is by the harbor, and the second one is by the river. And yeah, next slide, Francis. Not sure why. Yeah, methodology, we can pass that. Yeah, now Vianga will talk about the findings.
Yeah, thanks, Danesh. Do you want to go to the first findings slide? Yeah, thank you. Okay. I will quickly walk you through some of our main findings. So in our interview schedule, we probed for information on respondents' socioeconomic context, climate change issues, non-conflict violence, social protection, and so on. In terms of their housing, it's mostly poorly constructed houses clustered together. For some, the concept of house is only one room. Some also share toilets or use public facilities. Most houses are built using timber and one house is connected to the other. That means two households would be sharing the same wall. And you can see some quotes that explain this. The shanties lie very closer to each other. When we step out into the road, we find a narrow space where only one person can pass by. So that's how their communities look like. So for most respondents, the tenures to their houses are not legal. They are unauthorized encroachments. None of them have individual ownership to their houses, but some are located legally through government leases. In terms of their economic conditions, all respondents fall into the category of urban poor. COVID-19 has only added another layer of economic vulnerability. Most respondents were informal workers or self-employed, but they have lost work due to COVID. So they have limited income, but increased debts. We also asked what they do for leisure in order to get a sense of their day-to-day lives. And we found that they have little time or opportunities for leisure activities or hobbies. So they have multiple responsibilities like family and child care, household activities, self-employment, and other responsibilities and burdens they encounter during flooding and etc. Next slide, please. Next slide. Yeah. So when talking about climate change related issues, the respondents from both areas experience flooding during rainy seasons. For those who live near the canal, this happens even with the slightest rain. And they talked about increasing frequency and intensity of these rain and flooding episodes. With flooding, they also face other problems like damage to household items like cupboards, beds, electronics, and so on. In addition, there is also the issue of having to live in polluted and dirty water that is sometimes mixed with toilet waste as well. Sometimes there can be animals like snakes or crabs in the water and they cause harm, and they also face skin diseases caused by dirty water. When the houses are flooded, the women in Lunupakuna site said they don't leave their houses but stay on even with the dirty water in the house due to various reasons. But the women in Samantranapura get to stay in a community center or a mosque. But in both sites with frequent flooding, the disruptions to their daily lives are also increased. You can see these points from the following extracts. The water comes up to the height of the house. We had to throw away 2 cupboards. We sit on chairs. All of us, including my sons and husband, we sit on the chairs. There were animals called crabs. They went inside my ear. So those are some examples. Next slide, please. Yeah. When probing into instances of violence, analysis showed multiple forms of violence, like economic violence, emotional violence, domestic violence, and so on. Some of them were consistent but triggered or increased with flood events. They also talked about other risks like break-ins, theft, and quarrels that happen both inside the house and in the community during flood episodes. Alcoholism was also an issue and linked with emotional abuse and domestic violence for some of the respondents, but not for all. But the stress and despair were common to all. So you can see some examples here. During that season, his brother comes and he drinks a lot during that time. The husband beats and does violence to me all the time. And then he will blame me, telling you brought me to your place, it's flooding here and there is water everywhere during rainy days. So, so violence directly caused by flooding. He beats me daily and I don't care about that, and so on. Yeah, next slide. Then we also talked about how they respond to these problems they discussed and about their support systems. From government and civil societies, they don't get much except for emergency relief. But in these also, they talked about discrimination in distribution of aid. There were no community-based organizations or initiatives that give them emotional support. There is also the case with relatives and other community members. From them also, they don't get much emotional support. Their experiences and stories are more individualistic, even though the flooding is a collective experience for them all. There seems to be some kind of acceptance of some level because most of these women have experienced these difficulties for prolonged time. Not many want to relocate unless they are given housing by the government because they know they can't afford it. Almost all the women talked about their children as an anchor and strength for them to face these problems. So these are some of extracts as examples. Yeah, I think Danesh, you can conclude.
Yeah. Thank you, Bianca. Just to summarize and highlight some of the challenges and maybe areas for future research. I mean, conducting the fieldwork was really hard, is very tough. We had 3 surges and we are just coming out of the 3rd one in the COVID environment. The government put multiple lockdowns, and then we were also very concerned about not going unless the locations were vaccinated or we were vaccinated, because we had people who we associated who were quite vulnerable. Second was the phones. I mean, the critical area that phones played. Without phones, we could never have done this. And these were from high-tech phones to just simple regular phones. And the IT, we used lots of Zooms, Dropbox, email, just connected and surpassed all distance and safety concerns. The data quality was, may have possibly got impacted because we were physically not there, but we were confident that the 10 interviews we did were of fairly good quality. There were ethical considerations because the respondents never got to see us. We were strangers coming through the phone, but we used contacts. We had there people who knew us and a field coordinator, Azam, who was well known to them. So trust was built there. As Bianca mentioned, there was a rash of risks they were living with, and which then led to some different forms of violence and other maybe kinds of impacts, which were social, economic, political, etc. Definitely, they were living very fragile and precarious sorts of lives, and their positions were very difficult, and they were living very close to proximities of some kinds of violence. An example was just walking in that narrow street, you could bump into someone and a fight could happen, or they were living by the river, or their houses were connected where water would leak. These were all spaces for violence to happen, just very close by, just it's within hand's reach. And then how did they adapt? People adapted in different ways, and that possibly is their own capabilities, the external capabilities, etc. And some of the family backgrounds, friends, etc. Tolerance, Bianca went into that, coping with it in different ways. Children played a huge part, and the support they got. The relocation was both ways. Do I want to do it? Do I not want to do it? Because it was a loss, a gain and a loss in different ways. And there was a duality there. And it was a moving target. Finally, this layers of risk, this is something Nausheen and Arabella both have been talking about, which I really like. Bianca and we tried to ask people what they thought was most important in their life. And there it was changing back and forth. And naturally they were willing to let go of things like floods and all that. All those things just happened, but they had bigger problems. They had problems of marriage, poverty, possible forced relocation. Those are big things. And these layers of risk were really, really interesting. And the aspirations, hoping for that better day, that something better, just keeping that hope alive. And the anchors were always the children. I am doing this to my children. They are the ones who keep me going, and I want them to have a better life. Yeah, so, yeah.
On that, some hope. A twist of hope at the end. We're going to pass. We are running out of time. Inevitably, the material is rich and we're trying to cover 3 contexts, but we're going to pass really quickly to Regina and Vera from Co-and-Career Design Initiative in Nairobi, which is a non-profit organisation that does both research, policy and direct community intervention to create one of their projects around creating participatory, safe and sustainable spaces for women and girls in informal urban settlements. So Regina and Vera.
Can you see my screen?
Not yet, Regina, but there is sometimes a lag. So I don't know if you want to start and we can sort it out in the background or wait for it just to catch up.
Okay. Okay. Let me just stop share and reshare again. Sorry.
Just to say to everyone, do put any questions in the Q&A if you want. I'll pass swiftly to Jaideep and Amy after this in case they have to go.
I'm able to see. Okay.
Regina, you can start talking and I can try and share.
Regina, do you want to start talking and Vera will try and bring it up?
All right, okay. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. And I heard Ari talking about coming from a sweltering UK. It's ironic that at the equator, it's quite chilly. So we're glad to be part of this conversation today, I think, and part of the project. There's been very interesting findings. Our team is made up of myself and Vera. My name is Regina Opondo and I'm the community director at KDI, and Vera is the research director. And the rest of our team includes Joe Mulligan, who's an associate director at KDI, Amos Wandera, Alan Nooko, Mary Bugeni, and Bosi Bori from both the community and the research team. So just a little bit about KDI. We were started in Kenya, in Kibera, and have since expanded to LA, Coachella, and Stockholm. KDI was founded in 2006 by 6 students at Harvard Graduate School of Design. Despite coming from different countries and getting, training in diverse disciplines, one question that they kept asking themselves was, how can we use these skills that we've learned to combat issues such as poverty, environmental degradation, and social isolation? So dealing with the social justice question. And in trying to solve some of those social justice questions, they found themselves in Kenya, where one of the founders was from, in an informal settlement called Kibera, which was quite next to where he lived, and starting out with a project there that has since grown to become an organization, but also a series of the KPSPs, which I'll talk a little bit more about. So KDI brings together quite a diverse group of people. And on the left, you can see the expertise that we have in-house. 2 guesses as to where Vera falls and where I fall. So on staff, we have planners, we have engineers, we have social workers, we have accountants and administrators. So it's quite a rich mix of people working at KDI Kenya. And we do our work through 4 particular service areas, which are quite connected. So the first one, of course, that is relevant for this conversation is research and test. But we also do quite a fair bit of build work. So we design and build, and sometimes we create plans for other people to build. And then we have planning and programming that goes on just in our daily work, but also around the sites that we have built work. and then advocate and educate. So we use a lot of the research content also to push for policy advocacy, to empower our communities to be able to also do things better, learn more about to be flood resilient and climate change resilient, but also to challenge their leaders when it's required. So what started off as one project by 6 students has since become our flagship project, the Kibera Public Space Project, and has grown into 11 sites, which are productive public spaces along the waterways of Kibera, working very closely with community groups. So they are sites for climate change adaptation, flood resilience. It brings together the built work that I talked about, the research, the community capacity for resilience, and then various services and programs, including business development skills. And it is a tried and tested model where we use facts on the ground from the communities we work with, and try to model these so that they're community hubs that provide network services to a whole gamut of people, not just those in the community-based organizations, but the community that they work with. So just a little bit of a context about Nairobi and of course Kibera. Of course, the existence of informal settlements is largely due to the colonial heritage of Kenya. We have pre-colonial patterns of urbanity and rurality where development happened along railway line or administrative centers. Some of this, saw segregation of towns by function, whether it was business, trade, administration, residential, as well as segregation by class and race. And therefore you found that the colonialists would, for residential purposes or even for business purposes, occupy higher land, and then the lower marshy flood-prone land was where you'd find some of the native settlements, and some of those settlements that then became informal settlements. Part of this colonial heritage has then contributed to a complicated land tenure system. For example, settlements such as Kibera often have no formal tenure arrangements. And then we've also seen this increase with rural to urban migration accompanied by the proliferation of small-scale trade and petty commodity production, including unserviced and unauthorized housing. Unfortunately, these post-colonial policies have continued. Post-colonial policies have continued with the colonial trend. So rather than break away from that trend, we've exacerbated it. So looking at the map, then you can see some of the informal settlements in Nairobi, and you can see where they lie according to according to the rivers within Nairobi. So after talking about Nairobi, welcome to Kibera. Kibera is the largest informal settlement in Kenya. According to others, the largest urban informal settlement in Africa. The word Kibera is Nubian for forest or jungle. And Kibera originated as a settlement in the forest on the outskirts of Nairobi, where Nubian soldiers returning from service with the King's African Rifles were allocated plots of land in the 40s, in 1904 rather, not in the 40s. And this was in return for their efforts, of course, in the various wars that Britain was fighting. So Kibera was situated on the King's African Rifles military exercise grounds in close proximity to their headquarters. The current population, we like to use 200,000, but you find some people quoting up to 1 million. So depending on who you believe, but the last census has the number closer to 200,000. And Kibera is currently divided into 13 villages and 2 estates. It's also been a site for a lot of slum upgrading exercises, either individual developments or collectively integrating several types of development. And it is also a politically significant area, not just nationally, because it is a battleground for national politics, but also for Nairobi City. It's a site of mobilization for political purposes. It is an opposition stronghold for many years. But the political connotations also have an effect on service provision with proliferation of cartels around power, water, and structure owners. But Kibera is also a beautiful and inspiring place, a hotbed of resilience, talent, and innovation. So just to get a sense of some of the work that KDI does, this is Andolo, which Vera will be talking a little bit more about, and it's where we drew some of our participants for the focus group discussions in the sphere. And Andolo was a place that people came to water their cows, but you can also see the bridge was insufficient, and when the river rose, then the flooding caused a lot of devastation. Since KDI worked with the Andolo Bridge community, we managed to put in place a productive public space that helps reduce the risk of flooding, which you can see the next site. So that's the bridge where the lady was standing, and you can now cross over into the site, which provides a laundry pad, but also has barriers to prevent flooding from affecting people's houses. It also comprises channels that drain water from the top of the hill down into the river. And you can't see it in the picture, but it also has a playground. So this is just an example of some of the work that we do as KDI to try and help the communities be more resilient to some of the climate change effects. I'll now invite Vera to take over on the research component.
Regina, I don't know if Vera's frozen. She did say earlier she was having problems with her line. Let's give her a second. Vera. I'm just going, apologies, obviously, with the
I've had a power
presentation.
cut.
Yeah, no worries. I'm just going to say to all of you, we're up to 11. I know people have to leave, but thank you very much for coming. I think the research teams, we will be staying on a bit longer. I know Jaideep's trying to stay for another kind of 15 minutes or so just to add his reflections. So yeah, Vera, quickly, thank you.
All right, I'll try to be as quick as I can. In 1 minute, these are the methods that we used. We used COVID-19 shaped methods, refining other projects to collect data for our work. So focus group discussions with Andolo communities and another community in Sokomoko, which I'll show you shortly, as well as our fields team who come from across Kibera. We also use the qualitative GIS method of data collection known as story spheres, where we're combining 360-degree images with essentially conversations and audio snippets. And we've spoken to 12 different residents on various things. And we've also trained others in the team to use this method. In terms of some of the findings that we had, and I think I'll just show you the 2 areas from the people that we spoke to. We got some really interesting conversations. So maybe just one thing to add, because I think a lot of what was shared already has some interesting exposure. So I'll go straight to this image because we spoke to people from this particular community who are, suffer frequent flooding, actually frequent multi-hazard exposure to flooding. They've got aspects of crime. They have really affected by also evictions because they're very near an area where there's a big road being built across the settlement. And really there's huge vulnerability in this area, vulnerability economically and socially. And we spoke to 10 women from this particular community, and they were ranging from either single mothers or single parent households, but also some who were acknowledged that others had been child parents as well before. And they mentioned to us that even though these are the type of risks that they face, just one thing to add that they said, which was quite interesting, and I think we would love to discuss more in this work, was that a lot of people, even though they know the risks are about living in an area which floods every year, this area flooded even this year where there were fatalities, that nevertheless, it is still more affordable to face the risk of losing property and potentially life than paying more rent to live in another part of the settlement. And they say, we are aware of the risk, but we prefer to live with this particular risk. They also spoke about the other things that they face in terms of insecurity and how it's managed. And they spoke a lot about vigilante management of risks in their particular communities. And then maybe a last piece to bring in is that they spoke about the vulnerability of children, of the elderly, of women, and particularly when facing particular issues of climate risk. There's a lot more to share, but I think because of time, we're going to pause now. And we'd be very, very happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vera. I'm sorry, I'm aware we haven't done the work justice at all in the time, but vigilante management of risks, I'd definitely like to go more back into that one in our discussions. But I'm going to bring in, because we're so fortunate to have a couple of colleagues who also are going to give us some external reflections on the work and how we start to make sense of the complexity of it all across 3 very different contexts. I'm going to bring in first Jaideep Gupta, who leads the Cities Cluster at IDS and has been the GCRF Challenge Lead for Cities and Sustainable Infrastructure. And thank you, Jaideep, for your continued support for all of our work. Yes, you choose where to pitch it, but I'd love to hear reflections on how we begin to draw this together and where you see it resonating in terms of kind of research themes, but also kind of policy implications.
Sure. Thanks, Ari, and thank you all for such rich presentations, even if squeezed on time. It's always a challenge to get these things across online, something that I'm hoping will very quickly be back to in person, but that seems a way off. So from my perspective, it's important to think of ways to scale up and scale down the work that you've been doing. And several questions occurred to me as I was listening to the presentations today. And I thought I might raise these questions with the acknowledgement, of course, that it is indeed the core objective of a pilot project such as this one to raise important questions, not simply answer the questions that come up. So in terms of scaling up, and I'll send these across the group as well, because I won't go into much detail with these questions now, but I'll circulate them as they occur to me. So in terms of scaling up, I suppose what are the larger geographies this has relevance to, and I'm thinking in particular, colleagues, of the sort of global compacts on climate risk, on mitigation and adaptation. How could they reorient their objectives, their metrics, and methods to account for the local, temporal, gendered everyday realities that you're presenting in such detail? And indeed, how the pandemic shapes, or I suppose reshapes, global risks, or for that matter, global debates on rights to, or indeed rights in the city. Is an important point of reflection. And from an infrastructural point of view, global narratives around loss and damage seem to be a relevant audience for this work. So how would you reorient and address that audience? In terms of scaling down, the richness of your work presents several anchor points that occurred to me on localizing risks and relevant resilience framings. Risks and vulnerabilities, Ari, as you said in the intro, they multiply and cascade in complex ways. And as the presentations have shown really vividly, I would want to know more on how we actually untangle these complexities and these trade-offs. And Vera, you began to mention these trade-offs around residents agreeing to put up with the risks that these disasters or localized disasters present themselves in a very economic trade-off kind of sense in terms of the cost of living elsewhere. But what are some of the more nuanced ways we can present these trade-offs, and what does the untangling of these trade-offs, these complexities, tell us about the appropriate metrics for success in development in cities? So I suppose how and indeed when is it appropriate to situate a good urban life as the objective for development is something that occurred to me as I was listening to all of the presentations. And indeed, are there other ways of framing success in cities that your group would want to offer? The scaling up and scaling down are, of course, dependent, I suppose, at least in part, on the state of data infrastructures. And Nosheen, this is something we've discussed recently, in that urban agglomeration produces quite complex and scalar politics in which data production is, I suppose data production is both a source of power, but it's also therefore a pathway for disenfranchisement. So what does your work tell us about, what data is relevant? How should it be collected? How should it be shared? Indeed, another scale that seemed relevant to me, and several of you touched on this, is that of research and pedagogy itself. And this goes beyond the challenge of operating during the pandemic. What does your work tell us about developing an infrastructure roadmap to inform future investment decisions in research and innovation, or indeed the development of new projects from concept to design to implementation? We often ask for infrastructural research to connect with the sorts of human and temporal scales that you do so vividly. But there continue to be very serious epistemic, ontological gaps that prevent practical action in this regard. And of course, a particular challenge in this is to place the social sciences and humanities in meaningful conversation with engineering and physical sciences. So those are some of the broader questions that stood out to me, and I'm just going through my notes if there are any others. But indeed, Ari and colleagues, this has really been quite a commendable effort to focus on risk and climate security in an important and novel way that indeed does push against the sort of linear and deterministic visions of urban futures. And I'm keen to hear more on what the group has to offer and where you'll seek to take this work in the future.
Thank you so much, Jaideep. I'm just going to say thank you. Oh, sorry. Thank you to those of you that put a couple of questions in the Q&A, because they were very specific to the Karachi team. I think Gulnaz and Nashin were going to try and type you responses. One was about the methodology Gulnaz was using and some of the assumptions. One was about climate change attribution and the kind of data infrastructure one would be using to kind of make those assumptions and attributions. I want to bring in Amy Jones, who I have the pleasure of meeting for the first time today, but she agreed to join us late last night to give a perspective from ICLE, which is the local government network. Many of you will know it for sustainability and development issues, connects a huge number of municipal governments in conversation. Amy, I'm just really interested to find out how some of these kind of complexities we're trying to reveal here also sit within the global research agendas you're discussing at ICLE and within the concerns of kind of municipal leaders that you're working with. I don't know if you're able to give us a brief perspective on that. Amy, I don't know if you can hear us. I know she's still there. Okay, well, we'll give a few minutes. Oh, Amy, hi.
Sorry, yes.
That's okay.
Hi. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of the webinar. I feel very honoured to have been asked to give my reflections. And yeah, thank you so much to all the speakers for such interesting presentations. It's been really eye-opening, learning about lived experiences of vulnerable groups and how conflict and violence do impact daily life. I've been thinking a bit about the third research theme of fragility and how can you kind of set up a space of dialogue where perhaps state institutions are absent, and yeah, how do you move forward with creating policy? So I suppose we know development is going to be most successful when vulnerable groups do have a say and they're being listened to. So I suppose when the relationship between state and community is fragile, it is difficult to address that balance. And I suppose the risk there is that it can lead to breakdowns of partnership and ultimately leave communities feeling quite disempowered, and as so they're not being listened to. So I think that from an ICLE perspective, we talk a lot about knowledge brokering and the importance of distilling the outputs of research projects to make sure that the state can be included and make sure that the findings of research projects are expressed in a meaningful way to make sure the state feel engaged and municipal actors, decision makers. So I suppose, yeah, it's setting up spaces of dialogue where the research outputs can be communicated and involving communities in that process as well.
Thanks, Amy. Absolutely. That's certainly what we have tried to do, even in a small project, and very hard in a very small scale project. And we've definitely felt that tension between the kind of outputs driven process of a research project, but the need really also to sit and build relationships with people. Certainly some of our Karachi researchers have described this very vividly, the need to put the surveys away, put the pens down, just sit in the heat with women in those communities and build kind of trust and hear their perspectives in a context of high distrust of external researchers, as well as state authorities and other agencies. I think what I'm going to do to wrap this off, Juliet from the UK, there's a wonderful question you put in the Q&A about the kind of literature base we've been using for this. I think I'm not going to get into that. I'm going to type you a brief response. Whilst to wrap up, I am just going to ask each of our kind of city researchers if they want to give a brief kind of final reflection for today. But this is very much, thank you, Jadip, for questions, because we are very much now entering into an intense process of meetings to kind of still share and discuss. So also, colleagues, if you want to pose yet more questions, we will be meeting Thursday morning to discuss. Nasheen, do you want to pick anything up in particular to conclude?
Yes, thank you, Ari. So in reference to both Jaideep's and Amy's comments and your comments just now, a couple of things that I'd like to point out. First of all, one is the question of data that Jaideep was talking about, open access data on precisely the kinds of things that we're looking at, on destruction, on displacement, on the triggers behind this. And Afia Salam posted a question in the Q&A, which I responded to, and so much of in terms of the challenges of trying to get one's head around numbers and trying to establish causalities. Is this climate change related? Is this related to state failure? Is this related to mismanagement? And all of these things are also very much about what kind of data you have access to, right? So these are the murky waters of actually simply not having access to reliable data, or what even is reliable data and who controls data, essentially, right? So this is also very important. Secondly, the state angle, the municipality angle, yes, absolutely so important. So speaking from the vantage point of Pakistan, and urban Pakistan more specifically, and Karachi even more specifically, or urban Sindh, Karachi has a history going back to the 60s of having very strong participatory mechanisms for urban planning, community-based participation, and this is reflected in a very, very famous organization called the Orangi Pilot Project, which was founded by Akhtar Hamid Khan and led by a woman called Parveen Rahman, who was assassinated back in 2013 for land politics, water politics, and so forth. And sort of, so the violent terrain in which we often operate as academics, as activists, as ordinary citizens, as non-governmental organizations, that this terrain of violence itself also determines the nature of municipal politics and the ability to remain connected with state agencies, especially at the municipal or the local level. So for example, since Parveen's death, this whole challenge of keeping state representatives, municipal agencies connected at the ground level has become a huge, huge issue, a huge problem in Karachi specifically. So how do you rebuild, right, from the ground up? How do you create these infrastructures of participation and knowledge building? These are precisely the kinds of challenges that we are facing in the 21st century as far as millennial cities are concerned, as we now confront the added challenges of climate change risks and impacts that coalesce or intersect with long-standing structural dynamics, long-standing structural inequalities and governance failures, and so forth. So, this is an open-ended thing, of course. I have before me no simple blueprint to suggest, but I hope that that the kind of conversations that we're having over here and the kind of data that we're trying to generate and these cross-geographical fertilizations that we're hoping for, that maybe these kinds of forums will also lead to precisely some type of generating the kinds of connections that we want between academics, practitioners, policymakers, developmentalists, and municipal agents, and so forth. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Nosheen. Vera, I want to bring you back in because I feel you got shortchanged in this webinar. Did you have anything else you wanted to add before we have to close? Or Regina?
I'll ask Regina to add if she wishes. I think there's really so much to talk about. For me, the cross-learning across the cities, it's just been really interesting to hear some of the, I guess, shared challenges, but also perhaps trying to see looking forward where and how, you know, what things could look like one way or the other. But certainly for us, there are really close similarities. I know we weren't able to do household surveys, for example, but what we've been able to read and learn from what is emerging from Pakistan is very, very similar to some of the other work that we do. So certainly I'd say on that front, and we'd love to be able to find, definitely from the outputs from here, we're going to be producing a brief and a couple of other outputs. We'd love to share those and share more of our findings as well through that. Yeah, so that's it from me. Thanks
so much, Vera. Danesh Vyanga, any final comments from you?
No, Arabella, thank you. This yeah, it was really interesting. Yeah.
Thank you, Danesh.
No comments.
So everyone, we're going to close, but please do get back in touch. Any of you who aren't involved in the project, we'd love to involve you. And network activities will also continue. We will be doing a Latin America focused webinar in the autumn, and we are hoping to host a policy roundtable to address some of those scaling up questions that Jaideep raised before the end of our network next March. So we may also look to re-involve some of you. Thank you so much for the time and for coming today. I've put a very inadequate response to the questions about literature in the chat, but do feel free to follow up by email, and we will be putting out a couple of publications just dedicated to some of the literature work we've been doing over the last 5-6 months. So thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.